Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I get off the train and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listener. It is Tuesday, October 8th in the afternoon. It's a lovely day. The sun is shining, the weather probably in the low 70s for those of you who know your Fahrenheit scale. On the Celsius scale, I honestly couldn't tell you. I ought to learn to do that calculation in my head. Well, it's been a good couple weeks for gaming. I had a really productive and fun Saturday. Actually, the whole weekend was really fun. I got a fair amount of gaming in. I knocked a bunch of games off of my 10 for 10s, my 10s for 10, my 10 for 10 lists, and I had a good time doing it. Over the weekend I got to play Cerebria, The Inside World, Terraforming Mars, Century Eastern Mountains, Rainbow Nights, and Gizmos. As the only one of those that isn't on one of my 10 for 10 lists is Century Eastern Mountains. All the others are games I'm trying to get played on my lists, so that's really exciting. So all of that said, I'm looking forward to sharing with you my experiences and talking about insights I've had. My main thinking today comes from a conversation I had with one of the guys learning Cerebria. I don't think he listens, but just in case, hello Alan. So learning Cerebria, I gave the video to the guy, to him to watch, and he said he would watch it, but then he would still like me to teach it as well, which worked out fine. The main thing he said, he knew it was going to be a challenging learn when he looked at Board Game Geek, and Cerebria has a 4.6 out of 5 on their weight scale. Now the Board Game Geek weight scale is some measure mixing difficulty to learn and challenging decisions to play, a matrix that's often used comparing depth and complexity. So I thought it would be interesting today to think a little bit about depth and complexity and give you some examples and talk a little bit about what I think of when I think of those two terms. I was inspired a little bit by this. I did a search just to see what language is out there or who's already talked about this, and I found an interesting list from Rahdo from a couple years ago, when apparently he said something about depth versus complexity on his podcast, and then he felt like he needed to explain it. I didn't read his list carefully because I didn't want to get spoiled, but when I saw how he did it, I decided to steal that idea. So the depth versus complexity chart, Rahdo broke it into three parts. He said that complexity could have light, medium, and heavy complexity, and the depth could have light, medium, and heavy depth. Thus, you'd get a matrix of 9 different combinations of those two. So I wanted to explain the terms first, and then I will share a little bit about each of those 9 boxes with you and see what you think. It's also possible that this will become a 2 or 3 part series if my interest in talking about these games exceeds the amount of time I have. I may find it more interesting to just talk about, say, heavy complexity games this time and go from there. So we'll see where I'm leaning as I'm talking about it. But first, to explain depth versus complexity. So essentially the difference between depth and complexity in this context is that complexity has to do with the number of rules, mechanisms, things to keep track of, components, corners of the rules, complications, that sort of thing. Anything having to do with structures built by the game designer to shape how the game plays would be complexity. The way Rahdo phrased it, he's like, a game that has high complexity is probably difficult to learn. It probably requires even experienced players to consult the rulebook regularly or to use elaborate rules reminders. A game with light complexity would have relatively few rules, would be easy to remember and easy to teach, and would play, as Rahdo put it, silky smooth. So complexity has to do with the kind of architecture that makes the game run. Depth, on the other hand, has to do with the kinds of choices and the kinds of experiences the player is having. Essentially, the deeper the game, the more intellectual energy the game welcomes and or encourages or requires for you to play it well. So a game with heavy depth and heavy complexity is going to be very complicated with lots of little rules, corners, and that sort of thing, but also requiring a deep amount of thought. Light depth and light complexity would be the opposite. It's going to be simple to play, easy to teach, and so on. So that's the depth versus complexity scale. Now what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about one category of those, and we'll see how it goes. If it uses up most of my walk, then I'll do the other two on the next walk. Especially because on the next one I wouldn't have to define depth and complexity. So let's start with heavy complexity. I'm going to start with heavy complexity, light depth, and work my way up. So a game that has heavy complexity, again, is going to have elaborate rules, complicated mechanisms, often requires a return to the rule book as you're playing, and so on. So a game with light depth, however, is going to have relatively simple choices and perhaps will feel similar from play to play. So there might be an obvious right choice or just a couple simple choices you could make. So a game with heavy complexity and light depth, honestly, is probably not going to be super enjoyable unless the experience is really fun thematically, because that's the third leg of the triangle that I haven't articulated here, which would be theme or style, but we're not doing that today. All right, so I had 3 games marked down as heavy complexity, light depth. The first one is Elder Sign. Now, Elder Sign is a dice rolling game that's strangely complicated to teach. It involves a Yahtzee mechanism, involves dice that get taken away. If you're playing it the way I am with all the expansions in, there's a whole bunch of extra sets of rules. Often there are cards that will do things that no other card does, so you have to kind of be ready to show those cards and use those. So all of these things mixed together to make a game that's actually fairly complicated to learn. But once you know how to play it, the choices are relatively light. Basically, you just have to decide whether or not to go after a particular obstacle and whether or not to use the bonuses that you have. In my experience, most of the time it makes sense to use all the bonuses you can for anything that's at all difficult. Usually because the scaling odds of using a bonus mean that you should use it right away, because the bonus, like when you use a bonus that lets you have an extra die, for instance, you want to use it right away because that keeps the die in play the whole time. But sort of once you figure that out, that's not really a choice anymore. You just do that pretty much every time. So the choices become relatively rote, and whether you succeed or fail has very little to do with any choices you make. It's just how well the dice come out. So it's a fun game, but doesn't take all that much mental energy, especially once you know how to play. If you don't know how to play, it takes a fair amount of energy, because just understanding the way all of the mechanisms work is kind of a bear. Hence, heavy complexity, light depth. Another game I would point to that I feel like fits this category, heavy complexity, light depth, is Betrayal at House on the Hill. Betrayal at House on the Hill is one of my favorite thematic games. It's a horror game in which you are exploring a mansion and attempting to find whatever the creepy thing is inside. It actually took me many plays to get all of the little rules down. The main rules are relatively simple, and if the main rules were the entirety of the game, I would call this medium or even light complexity, because you move, if you reveal a tile, you put it down. If you draw a card, then your turn is over. You read the card, do what it says. There's some dice rolling involved. So the first half of the game, pretty simple, probably medium complexity, just because you have to keep track of all these different scales of points and everything. And there are a few rules about how you interact with turns that you could get wrong and ruin the game. But then you have the turn in the middle of the game where one person becomes a traitor. And once that happens, the rules get incredibly complicated. There are 50 different scenarios in the base game and another 50 in the expansion. Each one has its own set of rules. Actually, each one has 2 sets of rules, really, because the trader gets one set and the players get another set. The way those rules interact is often really difficult to understand, and sometimes so difficult that you play it wrong, or you have to consult the other team, especially if the person, like in my family, I'm the one most likely to understand the rules on reading them. So if one of my children becomes the trader, they'll often have to consult with me about how the rules work. So from that perspective, it's really complex. So definitely heavy complexity. But at the same time, again, the decisions you have to make are generally relatively light. Even after the trader mechanism triggers and you know who the trader is, a lot of times the thing you have to do is just like pick up 3 things and bring them to here, or go to this place and do a thing. And often there's not really a lot of decisions to make, and anytime it feels like there would be, it's really just the complicated rules masking the relatively light decisions. So from that regard, Betrayal at House on the Hill is another light depth, heavy complexity game. The final one I want to point to in this category is Fortune and Glory, which is a game from Flying Frog Productions, one of my favorite companies. They make really, really good thematic games that are definitely heavy complexity, light on depth. Fortune and Glory is a great example of this. You have a character, you're running around, you're investigating things. The robust nature of the stories the game is telling are really fun. But the decisions you have to make are relatively light, and there's a little bit more. This one maybe verges on medium depth, but at most barely. Really, it's a light depth game, but heavy complexity, tons of little rules to keep track of, really complicated differences in how things happen, so you have to constantly be looking at the rule book. So from that perspective, Fortune and Glory, definitely heavy complexity, but light depth. So that's the first box. Second box I will talk about is medium depth, heavy complexity. So this is games that are very complex, again, but medium depth now. There's a bit more to think about, a few more choices, more interesting choices, but it's not the epitome of brain burn. The 2 games I would put in this category that I've played a fair amount and would recommend here. The first is the Game of Thrones board game. Again, the teach on this game is a bit of a burden because it's very complex. There are lots of different little things going on, lots of things to keep track of. But in terms of depth, there's a fair amount going on. You're watching other players. You're trying to get a hold of these strongholds. I also wouldn't call it incredibly deep. I mean, there is interaction you do with the other players, and there's a fair amount of decisions to make. But all of those decisions are relatively known, and you sort of lay out a strategy and pursue it. So there's certainly a lot to think about, but not in the same way that some of the deeper games function. Another game in this heavy complexity, middling depth, I would say is Mythotopia. This is a Martin Wallace card and area control game. It's from his series of games that are built around the deck building mechanisms, which he started with A Few Acres of Snow, and then A Study in Emerald, and Mythotopia, and A Handful of Stars. All these games involve area control and deck building kind of blended together, and they're all pretty complicated. They're difficult to teach. I've actually come to think that A Study in Emerald is not that difficult to teach, but there's still a fair amount going on. And there's a lot of rules corners, in part because Wallace did not, I think, put enough energy into developing the rule book in a smoother way, so they're kind of clunky that way. I mean, I like the games quite a bit, but they do suffer from that. That said, I think what's actually going on in Mythotopia, in terms of it's an area control game, you're trying to get control of these different realms and the lands and earn points. This aspect of it is, again, there's a fair amount going on. It's medium depth. It's not the lightest game. You do have some significant choices, but it's also not going to crush your brain in a vice, the way some other games would. Which leads me to my last category, heavy depth, heavy complexity. I actually have the least to say about these games because they are mind-crushing. But I would say the one I've played most in this category is Through the Ages. Through the Ages is a game about, it's a civ builder, it takes several hours, you're managing all sorts of different resources, and there's like 9 different kinds of actions you can take, and different cards will do different things, and you're trying to anticipate what the other person's going to do, and there's politics, and it's just, not only is it super complicated, there's just a ton to keep track of and a ton to think about, and it's just a very deep game, on top of the fact that it's very complicated. The other game, and the one that started this conversation, is Cerebria, the Inside Mind, from Mind Clash Games. Again, there's like 14 different actions you can take on your turn. There's 3 different resources to keep track of that are different currencies. It's a very complicated game, really challenging to play and do well at. And at the same time, on top of that, really difficult to think about. There's a lot of different levers to pull, a lot of different ways to fight for control of the areas. You're fighting for multiple levels of control at a time, plus other scoring mechanisms. This is a very complicated game, both in terms of depth and complexity. Hence, the third column. So I'm curious, what games would you put in these 3 categories? I'm going to do another episode with the other 2 categories of medium complexity and light complexity. So I will join you again in another episode. Until next time, thanks for joining me. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.